great to have you back as we're continuing our studies of the book of Revelation. If you've been following along, you know that we're just barely into chapter 17 of this remarkable book. We made it to the first 6 verses or so last time we were together. And at that point, we were introduced to the 2 major figures that are portrayed for us in this chapter. We have this woman who's of course externally beautiful, but when we look inside, we see that within is deep corruption and so on, described rather graphically in this chapter. And then we find that she's sitting on a great beast. And the image we're supposed to have in this portrayal of an idea is that the woman is resting comfortably and securely in a place of what appears to be protection on a great beast. And of course the beast itself is Rome. So what we have is Jerusalem propped up by Rome and feeling very, very comfortable. This is actually going to be highlighted even more in the next chapter, chapter 18, when we hear this woman saying, I sit as a queen, I'm not a widow, I'll never mourn, I've just got it made, everything's great. You know, that's really the celebration she has there in chapter 18. But again, we're going to see, of course, that even when she thought she was so secure, there's going to be a great reversal of her fortunes. The same thing is told to us in chapter 17. Chapter 17 begins with the woman resting on the strength of Rome, but then toward the end of the chapter we learn that the beast is going to turn against the woman, that he's going to bring her to ruin and leave her naked. He's going to eat her flesh, burn her with fire. It's going to be a very different outcome than the woman was expecting. Interestingly, that attack that ultimately consumes this woman, the city of Jerusalem, actually began as an attack on God's people, on the Lamb and on his people. And we'll see that as we look at this chapter and as we go along in it. This chapter has sometimes been called by commentators the timestamp of the book of Revelation. This is certainly the chapter that gives the greatest grief to people who are wanting to make Revelation a late date product, that is the end of the 1st century. This chapter represents virtually an insurmountable hurdle to that particular problem. This was what caused the great Notre Dame scholar I've mentioned before, Josephine Mazingbird Ford, to change her mind. She, of course, had taken the traditional view that, based on an obscure statement by Irenaeus, Revelation had to be dated late in the 1st century, but as she examined it more closely, and especially as she kept trying to thread this needle of chapter 17, she finally was convinced that the early date has to be taken much, much more seriously, and that indeed is exactly what she did in her great commentary. Well, we're going to be looking at what takes place here. I want to give you the whole chapter, because really the whole thing ties together, and if we don't hear it from start to finish, we can kind of get lost in the deep weeds here a little bit. So even though we looked at the first few verses last week, we'll recite those once again and go right down to the end of the chapter as we're proceeding. So this is chapter 17 of the book of Revelation, beginning at verse 1. This is the word of God. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, Come, I'll show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her fornication. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit to a desert. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, Why are you astonished? I'll explain to you the mystery of the woman and the beast she rides that has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and will come up from the abyss and go to his destruction. The inhabitants of the land whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world will be astonished when they see the beast, because he once was, now is not, and yet will come. Now, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other is not yet come. But when he does come, he'll only remain for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7, is going to his destruction. The 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the King of kings and Lord of lords, and with him are his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns will hate the woman. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." So there's our text, remarkable text for sure, isn't it? Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get underway. Father, we're so grateful that you have given us this key to an understanding of the great events that took place there in the first century, and out of it great lessons that have been applying all through the history of your people, including the very day in which we live now. We pray that we would be fair to the text, that we would be able to understand its intended meaning, and that as a result of that would be able to legitimately apply it in our own lives as well. And for all of that, we give you thanks in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, well, here we go. This is verse 7. The angel said to me, "Why are you marveling?" Of course, John has looked at this woman, and the external beauty probably captivated him for a moment, but then he recognizes that just under the surface is this deep, swirling corruption. And of course, he understands he's looking at Jerusalem, and it is a rather striking and surprising kind of image to see the holy city now swept up in this kind of deep and corrupt reality that lies within. The angel says, "I'll tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns." The angel asks why he's marveling. You know, it kind of reminds me of that time when Jesus in Holy Week was down in the precincts of the Jerusalem area, and he'd just given a great diatribe against the religious leaders, punctuated by the statement, "Your house is left to you desolate." Desolate, shutters blowing in the wind, you know. An empty place devoid of its central purpose of worship. A house left desolate. The disciples were kind of shocked to hear that, you know. As they're leaving the temple area, they point out to Jesus as if maybe he'd missed it. "Look, Lord, at all of these great stones. Don't you realize this is one of the wonders of the ancient world? Don't you realize that this is a remarkable edifice that we thought was going to survive till the end of time? And you've just said this house is left desolate. What in the world can you mean by that?" And Jesus simply reemphasizes, kind of doubles down on the point. "I tell you guys, not one stone is going to be left upon another. It's all going to be thrown down." Of course, the disciples wonder about that, and later Jesus gives them what we commonly call the Olivet Discourse, promising them that this generation will not pass away till all these things are fulfilled. And that is indeed exactly what happened. Even though that temple had so much external structure and beauty and was so impressive, nevertheless it was going to be torn down. It is a reminder to us, you know, there are venues in the world that are characterized by incredible architecture, art, wealth, displays of what appear to be, from this world's point of view, the most magnificent exhibits of things that which would cause people to be impressed. But we must never be carried away by that kind of opulent display. Nothing wrong with architecture, nothing wrong with art, you know, it's all fine. But we should never be deluded into thinking that because there's this external beauty, it translates into internal integrity. And that was certainly what was missing here in first century Israel and in Jerusalem and in the temple. So it represents what the angel calls a mystery. The mystery is that Jerusalem, for all her beauty, was actually being propped up by Rome. And the even more surprising mystery is the same Jerusalem that was being propped up by Rome was soon enough going to be destroyed by Rome, carrying out God's decree, God's mandate. And that, of course, is exactly what chapter 17 is telling us. So we have the woman, a symbol of the city of Jerusalem. We have the beast, a symbol of imperial Rome. And now we begin to have the angel explaining the details of these two remarkable visionary ideas. So first of all, the angel says, the beast that you saw was, is not, and ascends out of the abyss and will go to his destruction. And he adds, those who dwell in the land will be astonished, they will marvel, but it's only those whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, those whom God has not chosen to have eyes to see and ears to hear, those who do not see the kingdom of God, because as Jesus said, a man has to be born again before he can see the kingdom. Those whose names are not in that book will be astonished at the beast. People whose names are in the book, by necessary inference, are going to see through this pretense and realize what's really going on. But of course, the focus now is on this external display and how impressive it was to those who were swept away by its remarkable appearances. So they're going to be amazed when they see it. Their names are not written in the book, and it's going to be when they see the beast that, as we saw before, was and is not and yet will be. Well, this phrase, the beast that was and is not, and so on, as we try to figure out what's going on, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is it is a kind of parody on the most important name for God that we run into in the Old Testament. You know, when Moses was there at the burning bush, God introduced himself. Hello, my name is I Am. My name is Yahweh. Yahweh, I Am. And it stands in the great understanding of the Hebrews for the fact that God is the perfect reality behind everything. He's before everything. He's after everything. He holds everything together by the word of his power. He is the fundamental core reality by which everything else is sustained. He is I Am. And of course, the name means much more than that, but it certainly means at least that. The book of Revelation actually takes that name and rather expands upon it. We hear of God who is and who was and who is to come, as if it's supposed to be, in a sense, a further explanation of the great significance of the divine name. But this is a parody on that. This is a little bit of a kind of caricature of that name. You know, Rome was known as the eternal city. They had kind of rewritten their past a little bit and made it increasingly glorious, so that by the time we reached the first century, Rome just seemed to be this remarkable, great reality with all of this incredible, glittering glory in its past. And of course, that's part of what is impressive to the people who are swept away by the image. But the problem is that right at the moment, Rome wasn't looking so good. It was, but is not. You know, the great glory of the past wasn't quite so conspicuous in the present. We have Nero, who's a whack job right there on the throne, and it's only going to get worse for a while. He's going to go from bad to worse, and even after he's gone, there's going to be the chaos of the year of 4 emperors, and all of that is just going to throw the whole thing into turmoil, and it might make you wonder where all that glory went. And yet finally, Rome will sort of come out the other side, but in a somewhat different form. Rome will survive, but for a while people weren't so sure about that. And this is the moment now when Revelation is addressing God's people and pointing out that that's really the story. Rome has this sort of pretentious past, really overblown in some ways by the great Greek Roman historians, but now shaky. It'll survive, but it'll look very different by the time we're done. Well, the people who dwell in the land, of course, are very impressed with Rome. And of course, they're relying on the great power of Rome. Their names, however, are not written in the book of life from the creation of the world, a way of saying that they are the unfaithful ones. They are the ones who in some sense are blind, and thus they're swept away by all the wrong things. Rather than relying on the God of the old covenant who had seen them through to the initiation of the new, they are turning their backs on that God and declaring, we have no king but Caesar. So they're marveling now at the beast who was this great past, now is a little shaky, is going to continue to exist. But of course, the point is that Rome is not exactly what it seems to be. It had a glorious past, a shaky present. It'll stabilize under Vespasian, and that will indeed be the story that succeeds after the year 70 AD. I mentioned to you before Josephine Masingburg Ford, who really, as she got to chapter 17, I think this was really what sort of changed her mind about her whole view of Revelation. And she did a deep dive into really just exactly what's going on here and came up with an interesting theory. I don't know what you think of it, but I'll run it past you here. This is from her commentary, in which she ties in some ways what we're describing here to the career of Vespasian, who she sees as a little bit of a microcosm of the entire experience of Rome. So she says this: the beast, quote, was, and she sees that as referring to Vespasian in favor with Nero. Nero, of course, at the beginning of the Jewish revolt, sent Vespasian to put down the revolt, and at that point, Vespasian was in good stead with Nero. But then he is not. Vespasian fell from favor because of some political machinations and will come up from the abyss. And she notices that Vespasian was restored with the help of what were called the men of the pit, otherwise known as the men of the abyss, which was an epithet for perverse men from Qumran, she says. The Qumran down by the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. I think you know that. And as a result of some internal politicking, Vespasian was able to be reinstated, you might say, with their help. And thus, she says, Vespasian stands in parallel to he who is to come. And so, she sees a parallel between Vespasian and Rome itself. She says, quote, in a sense, the empire passed through the same stages. It was, glorious past from Caesar to Nero, was not in the late days of Nero in the critical year of 4 emperors, that's the year 69, and then came again when Vespasian brought order to the general Roman world. It's an interesting idea. I'm not opposed to it. I think it has some merit. But one way or another, I think we see what's going on. Was, is not, shaky present, is going to survive, but in a somewhat more modest form, as indeed turned out to be the case. Well, if we had any doubts about that, really, the next verse and the next 2 or 3 verses just nail down even more precisely what we need to understand is going on here. The angel says to John, here's a mind. This is for a mind with wisdom, and then begins to interpret the details of this beast, saying, first of all, the 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. If I were to say to you, the city of 7 hills, you would probably immediately recognize that's the standard name, the nickname really, for Rome. And it was that way in the ancient world. It goes clear back to the founding era of Rome, 753 BC, when Romulus, the brother of Remus, killed his brother and established the city. And the rulers there in that city over the next several years began to build the city outward, and each one would sort of conquer a different hill, so pretty soon you've got a city so-called of 7 hills, and that nickname stood, and by the time we get down to the 1st century, that was pretty much a standard reference to Rome. So anybody reading this would immediately take it to be a reference to Rome, and rightly so. One commentator said the 7 hills, which refers to Rome, of course, and also has the importance of the number 7 and the mountains as symbols of strength. And so in the imagery of Revelation, this works out rather nicely, doesn't it? The number 7 kind of stands for completion and perfection. Mountains will often stand for great displays of strength, so 7 mountains would suggest Rome is the invincible city. Rome is the city of glory. Rome is the city that could never be moved. And so we have that as an initial understanding, and that's why Jerusalem feels so secure. Instead of trusting her covenant Lord, Yahweh, who could have given her the true security she sought, she has gone rather after security with Rome. She's prostituted herself, is the graphic language used here, with Rome to get security from Rome, the pagans, rather than from her true God. And so that's kind of the first impression we have. But then the angel actually gives us more data. He says they are also 7 kings. So those 7 heads stand first of all for 7 hills, but also for 7 kings. And now we're told 5 of those kings have fallen. 1 is. The other will come, but he won't last for very long. So it's another kind of symbolic parallel here. In this case, we have 7 kings. 7 hills, 7 kings, 5 have fallen. Well, if you ask anybody in the first century who was the first king of the Roman world, of course, they didn't use the word king. They used the word Caesar, which was the family name of Julius Caesar, and that was the term. They were emperors. They were de facto kings, but they avoided that term because Rome had officially rejected kings way back in 509 BC, so they were kings in fact, but not in name. But for Revelation's purpose, the point is pretty obvious. The first of those Caesars, the first of those kings was Julius Caesar. That was the family name, like Caesar was his last name, Julius Caesar, what a guy. He was universally regarded as the one who founded the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, you see. When Suetonius tells the history of the Caesars, he begins with Julius Caesar because that's where everybody saw it beginning. It took place when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, a little stream really in the north of Italy, which demarcated the northern border. And by so doing, in 49 BC, when he crossed with a small force, a small military force with him, it was an illegal act, and it was a direct challenge to the Republic of Rome, which was under the rule of the Senate. And when he crossed the Rubicon, I won't go into all the details, but to just take it for granted, when he crossed the Rubicon, that was an illegal act challenging the authority of the Republic, you see. The Senate was defended by Pompey, the great Roman general, at one time actually the son-in-law of Julius Caesar, but now they found themselves on opposite sides of this contest. The Civil War went on for a few years. Pompey was eventually assassinated in Egypt. And as it turns out then, Julius Caesar was the one who, in a sense, transformed the Republic into the empire. He didn't really have a chance to rule because, of course, he was assassinated in front of the Senate there in 44 BC. Beware the Ides of March, et tu, Brute, all of that we get from Shakespeare's play. But that did happen. It happened in 44. There was a little interruption for a few years, a kind of triumvirate of rulers, Lepidus, Mark Antony, Octavian, all ruled over Rome for a while, but eventually it devolved to a civil war between Octavian, the nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony. And of course the battle took place there in Actium in 31 BC, and Octavian was successful in defeating Mark Antony, who died in the arms of Cleopatra, unless it was Elizabeth Taylor now, and you've got to be a certain age to appreciate that. But one way or another, that was the end of Mark Antony. And that brings the second of these Caesars to the throne, who is Augustus. Augustus. Now, his original name was Octavian. That was the name he was given. But just a few years after he became the ruler in 31, the Roman Senate, so grateful that Octavian had more or less restored their prestige, not really their power, but their prestige, that to honor him, they gave him a divine name, the August One, which is a way of saying the one worthy of worship. And that really is the beginning of the Caesar cult. That's really the beginning of the point where the Caesar is viewed as one to be worshiped. Now, Augustus Caesar, Octavian, never pushed the point too far. You know, he didn't really try to make too much mileage out of that, but at least the idea was there, and certainly after his death, he was viewed as one who had become a kind of deity. He's a very important character. He was the one that was running the Roman world at the time of the birth of Christ, born probably 3 or 4 BC, you know. So Augustus Caesar is mentioned by Luke in his report of what's going on. The next ruler that comes to the throne is Tiberius. When Augustus Caesar died in 14, Tiberius, who was his adopted son, took over. Tiberius was more of a retiring kind of character. Augustus was out front. He was a showman. You know, he liked the public exposure. Tiberius was a little bit darker, but he was a thoughtful character. It was under the rule of Tiberius that the great events of the gospel took place. The ministry of Jesus, the miracles he performed, and of course the great events related to Holy Week, his crucifixion, his resurrection, the fact that he was seen, that he ascended into heaven, all of that took place under the reign of Tiberius, probably around the year 30 or so. That sent a shockwave, of course, across the Roman world. People were there in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost who were from Rome, and they went back to Rome. And they had that story. They'd been converted, and they established a church, and that church began to get traction. And the swift movement of the Christian faith throughout the Roman world was something that everybody was aware of, including Tiberius himself. And there are records that Tiberius, before his death in 37, actually submitted a resolution to the Senate in Rome that Jesus Christ should be recognized as deity. That's how compelling the case was. We learned that from Tertullian, as we've mentioned on other occasions. Unfortunately, before that particular resolution could quite get anywhere, of course, Tiberius died. It was only 37, just a few years later, you see, and that was the end of Tiberius. The momentum for that move might have continued, except the next character who came to the throne had an absolutely different perspective on things. His name is Caligula. That's actually a nickname. It means little boots. Caligula was the son of Germanicus, who was the most famous Roman commander, military commander of the day. And the men serving under Germanicus gave him that nickname. His real name was Gaius, but little boots. He didn't like that very much, but that was the name that stuck. He became the ruler. He was just a young man at the time. In the beginning, for the first few months, he looked like he was going to do okay. But he got some kind of disease. They called it brain fever. It doesn't sound too good, does it? Brain fever. And when he recovered, it was not much of a recovery. From that point on, it's fair to say that he was pretty much unhinged. He was the one that kept the whole idea of the emperor being worshipped to a brand new level. And in fact, Caligula wanted to build a great statue, or many of them, and put them in every major temple of the ancient world, including Jerusalem. He wanted to put a big statue of himself right in front of the temple there, so that as people came into worship, they would have to bow in a kind of worshiping obeisance to Caligula. It didn't happen. One of Caligula's friends there in Rome at the time was a character by the name of Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa, mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 12. Herod Agrippa, then in Rome, a friend of Caligula, heard his plan, took him out for a beer and said, dude, I don't think you want to do this. You know, I think you're going to be biting off a whole lot more problems than you anticipate, because if you put a statue in front of the temple, you're going to precipitate, you're going to trigger a revolt, the likes of which you can hardly imagine. And Caligula listened to him and actually decided not to go that path. Well, Caligula was so out of control that his own bodyguards assassinated him just a few years later in 41. And that brings now the 5th. Remember, it says 5 have fallen. Well, this is number 5 now of those rulers who had fallen. This is Claudius, came to the throne in 41. Decent character, decent ruler, kind of another retiring sort of character, but competent. He's actually best remembered for having conquered Britain in 44. Early in his career, he sent forces there and actually conquered the lower part of of Britain. And he was famous for that. In fact, to celebrate his conquest, he named his one and only son, who was born shortly thereafter, Britannicus, in celebration of the conquest of Britain. So Claudius ruled for a few years. He had several marriages, the last of which was to a woman named Agrippina. Agrippina the Younger. She was actually a descendant of Augustus Caesar. Agrippina the Younger had a child by a prior marriage whose name was Nero. And Agrippina wanted Nero, because he was older than Britannicus, to be the heir to the throne in the event that Claudius would die. And under pressure from Agrippina, Claudius agreed, and so he gave that nod to Nero that he would be the successor. But the more that Claudius watched Nero, the less impressed he was with this young thug. You know, he's only a teenager, but he realized that the kid was really not very stable, probably not going to do much good for Rome, and he actually began to back away from that commitment and shift his focus once again on his younger son, Britannicus. Agrippina learned about that, did what any self-respecting Roman wife would do in the ancient world, and poisoned her husband, got rid of him. And so as a result of that, it did bring Nero to the throne. Nero came to the throne then in 54, and he is the one, of course, now that the text is saying now is. So 5 have fallen, the 5 we just looked at. Revelation is written under the reign of the one who now is, who is Nero. Nero rules from 54 to 68. Now, in the beginning of his reign, although personally he was not very impressive, he was actually overseeing a fairly stable time, because he really didn't care much about affairs of state. He didn't want to be bothered down with accounting sheets and that kind of stuff, So he left the day-to-day rule of the empire in the hands of 3 very competent administrators who carried on the day-to-day business of the empire. One of them was his own mother, Agrippina. Another was Burrus, the head of the Praetorians, a competent military man. And the other one was Seneca, who was the famous Roman Stoic philosopher who also had great administrative skills. And for some years, until Nero turned about 20 or so, things were fairly stable. But then at that point, Nero began to desire to have more influence. And when he ran into resistance from this little ruling committee, he just got rid of them. So all 3 of them were killed, including his own mother, either by suicide or assassination. They were put to death. And Nero now had the whole rule of the empire all to himself. Well, this guy was indeed a megalomaniac on steroids, and he wanted to remake all of Rome after the image of Nero. He wanted to rename the city Neropolis, and call it by his own name. And so he thought the best way to do this would be to destroy a bunch of the city and rebuild it in a great, more glorious kind of expression that they'd ever seen before. And so he actually, apparently, history seems pretty agreed on this, orchestrated a great fire which burned down about a third of the city. That was in the summer of 64 AD. And then a couple of days later, he came out with wonderful blueprints as to how to rebuild that whole part of the city. Well, the people figured out pretty fast that didn't quite add up. For him to have all of those blueprints already, ready to roll right after the fire, when the smoke was still kind of in the air, they took a very dim view, and there was a huge amount of hostility and negative reaction. And Nero then needed a scapegoat. He needed to blame somebody. Apparently, Jewish administrators in his regime suggested that maybe he should blame those weird people that were called Christians. They'd been troublemakers anyway. Why not pin the blame on them? And Nero thought it was a good idea. And so in November of 64, he launched an imperial and official persecution of Christians. It lasted for 3.5 years. It went from November 64 to the summer of 68, and during that time, of course, we have an empire-wide persecution of Christian people, centered really in Rome, but certainly spreading throughout the entire empire. This was, of course, the reason that the book of Revelation was written. It was written to tell people that these hard times are coming, so buckle up, get ready. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but it's going to be over before too long. So just hang in there in the meantime and be steady and trust God in the process. And Revelation really, of course, presupposes that whole persecution that took place under Nero. So 5 have fallen. One is Nero. He dies in 68. The other has not yet come. The next ruler was Galba. But when he comes, he'll only rule for a little while. It was 7 months, actually. And that gave rise then to what's called the year of 4 emperors, 69, in which one right after another emperors came to the throne and were assassinated. There were palace coups. The whole thing threw the Roman city, and in some ways the whole Roman Empire, into a state of considerable instability, anarchy, and it really looked for a time like Rome might not even survive it. We've looked at this before in the records that are given to us from Tacitus and others, so I won't go through all that again, but you're familiar with all of that took place, the chaos that followed, and then of course finally, after Jerusalem fell in 70, Vespasian took the throne, the guy that had been the commander there, launching the Roman assault on Jerusalem, but then going to Rome and finally taking over. And he brought some stability. But it was a very different kind of Rome that followed these events than that which had taken place before. Vespasian wasn't carried away with all kinds of desires to be worshipped, that kind of thing. You know, it was a different sort of place. One commentator said, the specificity of the statement here is probably one of the most impossible puzzles faced by those who argue for a late date for Revelation. That's what Dr. Ford discovered, and others who've looked at this seriously have found the same thing. The attempts are ingenious and highly improbable. Of course, some people try to figure out a way to triangulate some sensible way to see this with a late date in spite of what is stated here quite clearly. But those attempts have been, at best, really kind of exercises in futility. So that's kind of the picture. We have the picture of Rome. We have a detail of the meaning of the heads, the 7 hills, the 7 kings, and so on. And then we kind of return to a gestalt, as it were, of the entire beast. The beast that was, great glorious past, is not, is an 8th. Now notice it says an 8th, not the 8th. It's the beast itself, not any particular part of it, any head or horn or anything like that. You see, it's the beast itself, which in a sense now generically continues, as it were, as an 8th. It's a way of saying that even though Nero was taken out of the way, the momentum of this persecution would continue for a time. The chaos would persist. The meltdown would continue, the year of 4 emperors and so on, even after Nero's death. The grammar in Greek is a little bit more clear-cut than it's possible to translate it, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but simply note that it is significant that it says it's an 8th, and it's a way of saying that there's a kind of 8thness about it, as it were. It's just an ongoing effect. The momentum of that which had been started under Nero continues until the whole thing more or less grinds to a halt in the year 70, about a year and a half later. One commentator said 8th is the beast, not 8th as the beast is not dead with Nero, but returns in other incarnations, other iterations. It sort of continues, you see, through these multiple emperors that came along afterwards. He is an 8th, marked by the same brutality. 8 is the number of resurrection, once again talking about a kind of persisting effect of Nero's life even after he's gone. But in this case, even these 8ths will be eventually eliminated. In other words, the persecution against Christian people sputtered out. It fizzled out. That's really all you can say. It was intense for a while, but a day came when it basically was over. It was over. And while Jerusalem was there with smoke rising out of her, the Christian movement itself was able to carry on her work in this new day, you might say, as we hear in chapter 7, when a great multitude of every nation, tribe, language, and people, a great multitude that no one could number, now are holding palm branches and declaring that Christ is their Savior. So that's really the sense of what's going on here, and I think that at least gives a fair treatment of what we can understand from the description. You know, it's very interesting when Rome, after 70 AD, continued into the future. It was a very different experience for Christians. Christians had been beleaguered up until that moment, but almost like night and day, things changed. And after the fall of Jerusalem, the campaign against Christians was over. Vespasian had no interest in it whatsoever. His son Titus had no interest in it whatsoever. And Christian people, as Revelation 7 told us, came out of that great tribulation stronger, more numerous, spreading around the empire, preaching the gospel. There were indeed sporadic persecutions. The first of them came at the end of the first century under Domitian. That's where some people want to put Revelation, mistakenly in my opinion. But there was a brief persecution. It only lasted a few months. In fact, there's no documented case of anybody actually being martyred under the persecution by Domitian. It was intense but brief, and then it was over. So for about 25 years, there'd been quiet, then one brief persecution, then for another 20 years, it was pretty quiet on the Western Front, and then a ruler named Trajan launched a persecution for a brief time against Christians. The letter of Pliny the Younger comes out of that context, very interesting history. And again, that didn't last for long, it lasted for a while. And then again, there's a period of relative quiet. Antoninus Pius in the middle of the 2nd century had a persecution, as did Marcus Aurelius. But the point is, the persecutions were somewhat sporadic. They were intense. People were thrown to lions. I mean, that did happen. But we sometimes have the impression that all through Roman history, it was a constant, unrelenting campaign against Christians. It was not true. It was sporadic, occasional, intense when it happened. There were martyrs, to be sure. But actually, by the time we get to the beginning of the 4th century, Constantine, it's over. And it took that long for a complete transformation of the empire. It all began really way back there, we might say, with the events that took place in 70 AD and the fall of Jerusalem and so on. The angel continues saying to John, "The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who've received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings along with the beast." The 10 kings, of course, you know that Rome was not one great consolidated country. It was an amalgamation of various rather independent provinces and kingdoms. And these kings, of course, ruled with a fair amount of autonomy, but they were beholden to Rome. They had to pay heavy tributes to Rome. In many cases, they were occupied by Roman authority, Roman soldiers, and so on. So the Roman presence was ubiquitous. But nevertheless, they, besides that, had some autonomy, that sort of thing. There were 10 of these that were the major provinces that constituted Rome at the time. This reference to 10 horns, of course, is an allusion back to Daniel, who foresaw this in the prophetic material we find there. Daniel chapter 7, for example. "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful, terrible, strong exceedingly." This is Rome, of course. "It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was diverse from all the other beasts," if you remember that vision there, "that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Well, the 10 horns that are being mentioned by Daniel are, of course, being mentioned by Revelation, and again, anyone alive at the time would immediately recognize. If I talked about the 50 states of the United States, of course, you'd recognize what I'm talking about. Well, these are the 10 provinces, really, of Rome. Rome had 10 imperial provinces, as one commentator. They were Italy, Achaia, Asia, Syria, Egypt, Africa, Spain, Gaul, Britain, and Germany. And so that's what would come to mind when you hear that. The text is saying that these kings, with whom the harlot, Jerusalem, had plied her trade. You see, instead of being a house of prayer for the nations, instead of that, she had led the people in the worship of the alternative deity, Rome. We have no king but Caesar. And she had made the nations drunk, therefore, with her misguided and idolatrous worship. And so she's going to serve as the instrument of their destruction. So these we hear are of one mind. That is, all of these independent rulers that were under the Roman umbrella were of one mind. They give their power and authority to the beast. When the decree went out from Nero that the Christians were to be persecuted, all of these provinces were on board. They didn't necessarily have to do that. They could have pushed back a little bit, but as it turns out, they all jumped on board and began to give their power and authority in one accord to the demands of the beast. He had launched this worldwide persecution, and as one commentary says, these 10 kings joined with the beast against Christ, persecuting the church throughout the provinces and subordinate kingdoms. But it begins, notice this now, this is an important part of the whole story. It begins as an assault on Christ and his people, but it ends as an assault on Jerusalem. There's a little bit of an overlap that takes place. So the beginning of this campaign targets God's people, the Christians, but by the end of it, it's shifted and all of the wrath of Rome is diverted and turned against Rome. That's what the last paragraph of this chapter is saying. So we hear they're going to make war against the Lamb, against Christ, but the Lamb will overcome them. Why? Because he's running the shop, friends. Because he's the one who is ultimately sovereign over these things. He is the Lord. He is the King of Kings. Those who are with him are his called, chosen, and faithful. This again is a point where God's people are being incorporated as co-participants with Christ in his victory. The campaign began under Nero as a campaign against God's people. They were the original target, but the church, as it turned out, was faithful. She survived. She thrived. I think the imagery of chapter 19 is really focusing on this when we see the rider on the horse riding into the pages of history, the armies of heaven following him. He is ruling with the rod, the sword that comes out of his mouth. We'll look at that, of course, in detail later, but the whole point is Christ is the one who is victorious. His people are victorious in spite of the campaign that was launched against him. One commentator said, "These rulers make war against the Lamb as godless rulers always try to dethrone God, taking their stand against the Lord and against his anointed. They unite in hating the Son of God as Herod and Pilate became friends during the trial of Jesus. The Lamb will, however, overcome them." Well, we're going to leave off right there because this last paragraph, where we see the transition from an attack on God's people to an attack on Jerusalem, that's really what is described in the last paragraph here, is so important, and the historical detail behind it is so strategic that I don't want to rush through that. And so what we've seen so far is the woman starts off in a very cozy relationship with Rome, sitting on the beast, thinking she's fine, thinking everything's secure. We have a detail describing the beast itself. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. It gives us a pretty clear time stamp as to when these things are going to take place. We hear of the beast that he had a great history, a kind of overly glorified history, but now is pretty shaky. He's going to come out the other end of the tube looking a little bit differently. And we see, of course, now that there's the beginning of a campaign designed to wipe out the Christian movement. That's what Nero wanted to do because he wanted to blame Christians for the conflagration that had taken place in Rome. But somehow, through an intricate series of events, the focus of this assault changed. And rather than being an attack on Christian people, who were, by the way, identified with Jerusalem, you see, Christianity was still tied to Jerusalem at that point, it became an attack on Jerusalem itself, even though the Christians were out of town. So it's an interesting story, a drama that unfolds, and of course, this chapter in particular really highlights the details of it. So we're going to leave off right at this point, and I'll just give you some thoughts. When you look at Rome and you think about the condition of Rome in the first century, you can't help but think to yourself, this really represents what amounts to a kind of statist religion. And statism, the idea of the state wanting really to have your worship, your undivided, complete loyalty, has always been in a competition with the only one who deserves your loyalty. And thus the lessons we learn about statism in the first century certainly apply throughout Christian history. So first thing to note here, statist power will rewrite an inconvenient history, boast of a utopian destiny, but deliver little more than slavery in the meantime. You know, statists always want to rewrite history. In the ancient world, they wanted to rewrite Rome to make it vastly more glorious than it was. In our day, we have people that want to rewrite history so that it serves their own agenda. Beware of anyone that wants to rewrite history. Statism always wants to do that, and that's exactly what was happening then, and it's happening to some degree today. Promising a utopian future. That's always been the promise of statism. If you'll worship me, I'll create a wonderful new world where everybody's happy, you know. But in the meantime, statism can only deliver slavery. And that's the thing we always need to bear in mind. It was true then, it's true now, it's been true consistently throughout history. Such statist power, number two, inevitably, quote, makes war against the Lamb. Because the most grave threat to statism is the king who reigns from Mount Zion. The kings of the earth take their stand against the Lord and against his anointed. That has always been the calling card of statism. Back there in the Roman world, Rome realizes that the great threat to their rule is these people who refuse to say Kaiser Kyrios. Caesar is Lord, and they insist rather on saying Jesus o Kyrios. Jesus is Lord, and some paid for that confession with their lives. That's been going on all through history. It is taking place today somewhere in the world, even as we're talking about it. That's always been the demand of statism. You have to give your allegiance in an undivided way to my authority, and there can't be any competitors on the block, or else it's going to go badly for you. That's really what was going on then. It's happening now. It'll probably continue to happen. Finally, the King of Kings leads his army through the pages of history as they build a kingdom using the weapons of the sword of God's word and the deeds of God's work. God's people are not called to stand up in a kind of holy, militant, violent war, you know, that sort of thing. There's a place sometimes for war, I realize that, but in terms of advancing the kingdom and its message, the gates of hell are not going to prevail against the power of God's word and the power of God's people doing Christ's work in this world. We're going to see this in detail in chapter 19, in which Christ rules through the sword that comes out of his mouth, and the people there are dressed in white robes, which are said to be the works of God's people. The white robes are the robes that they wear as they do the work of Christ in this world. And throughout human history, that's been the calling card of the Christian movement. Showing up, proclaiming the word, and doing the work. Building clinics, building hospitals, building schools, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, that sort of thing. That's been the work of Christ's people throughout history, and it will continue to be as we beat back the very gates of hell. Well, it's been great to have you along. I hope you'll be able to find your way back next time as we finish off chapter 17. And actually, we'll make a little bit of an incursion into chapter 18 as well at that point. So you can look forward to that about a week from now. In the meantime, thanks for participating, and I wish you God's richest blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you peace.